Another popular Activision shooter and Apollo's best game to date, as Atari Archive looks at Infiltrate and Megamania. While Megamania is objectively the better known and better selling of today's games, credit where it's due. Apollo managed to release a game that is genuinely solid with Infiltrate, and that deserves top billing this go-round. If there's one constant to Apollo's output thus far, it's that practically every game they have published has some aspect that just makes it kind of janky or otherwise mediocre no matter how promising it seems, with the possible exception of Space Cavern. This is likely due to the extremely compressed timelines that Apollo put its programmers under to produce their games, measured in weeks, not months. Yet Infiltrate doesn't really show any signs of these issues. The game achieves what it's setting out for very well. A key factor for Infiltrate clearing this bar may be that it wasn't designed internally by Apollo staff. Instead, this was created by Don Hoffman from Innovative Design Software Incorporated. IDSI was a developer that largely worked in computers, producing a handful of games for the Apple II and the Atari 400 and 800 computers like Pool 1.5 and Juggler. Hoffman unfortunately could not be interviewed in time for this video, but he put together a remarkably solid game that echoes titles like Donkey Kong, but has enough of a unique twist that it stands on its own. The basic play loop of Infiltrate is somewhat similar to Elevator Action, Taito's arcade game that came out the following year. You are a secret agent entering a structure full of enemy assassins that look a lot like aliens, with the task of grabbing secret documents. You are armed with a gun to shoot the assassins when you encounter them, though they are also armed and ready to fire on you. To move around the screen, you can ride elevators that go up and down a set number of floors. In practice, this is a little fussy and takes some getting used to, as it is very easy for your fast-moving character to dash on and then off the elevators before you start moving up and down. The key really is just standing next to the elevator as you automatically step on once it's on your floor. Once you grab a file, another will spawn on the opposite end of the screen for you to grab. All the while, the assassins are pursuing you. The red one in particular is aggressive and will fire on you the second it has a chance, while the blue one typically will leave you alone while you are on an elevator. Grabbing the documents earns you 3,000 points, while shooting enemies gets you 250 a pop, with an additional 75 if you shot them while they're on an elevator. Every 10,000 points you earn another life, with a maximum of 6 at any given time. Infiltrate includes 12 game variations. These adjust how fast and aggressive the assassins are between 3 levels, as well as whether or not they are always visible or if they can only be seen while riding an elevator. All of these options are available in 1 or 2 player games. Finally, the difficulty switches will adjust how far the enemy bullets will travel. On the B mode, they go about halfway across the screen, while on A, they will travel the full length. Infiltrate is a tricky game to get a handle on. The fast movement speed for your character, the assassins, and the shots all require you to pay pretty close attention to what is happening at all times. It is frankly dangerous to be too close to your foes, as not only can they kill you on contact, but at a certain range you simply won't be able to credibly avoid their bullets and fire back to protect yourself. The best strategy is to give them a bit of space and carefully move around, crouching after your shots to avoid any return fire. Once an assassin is downed, it's wise to be wary of the areas where they can respawn, as it is entirely possible that they will pop right back up near where you killed them. A couple of elevators also travel multiple floors, and these should be watched as a good way to rapidly travel around the screen, though your foes will use them just as readily. Even though Infiltrate doesn't seem to get much more difficult as far as I got in it, it provides a good challenge. Moreover, it doesn't have any weird issues with hitboxes or tuning that other Apollo games have featured. Some years ago, there was a concerted effort on the Video Game History Foundation's Discord server to track down Von Mai, author of Apollo's October release, Wabbit. This led through the National Archives in Texas, where some documents from Apollo's bankruptcy were being kept. Evidently, several ex-Apollo developers filed with the court system to get their final checks in early 1983, and this included IDSI. In this material, the archives held a photocopy of the contract between Apollo and IDSI for Infiltrate, and we can glean out some details about its creation here. First, the game's original title was Termite, as crossed out and rewritten as Infiltrate several times on the document. The sale for the completed game to Apollo appears to have taken place on July 30th, 1982, which means our turnaround time into September tracks with how quickly Apollo was making cartridges for distribution. IDSI also granted Apollo an option to purchase and publish any future video games produced on hardware other than the Apple II and Atari 8-bit machines. In exchange, IDSI received $10,000 up front and a right to an 80-cent royalty on all copies of Infiltrate sold once the accumulated royalties exceeded that amount. It's unclear if that ever happened. While the last wave of Apollo games saw mixed reviews, generally speaking, the reception to Infiltrate was quite positive. In the Texas-based Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Lou Hudson described it as a neat, different game akin to Donkey Kong, but nothing really like it. Logical Gamer's two reviewers were very positive on Hoffman's game, with Mike Wilson overcoming his disappointment that it wasn't a strategy game quickly to find it quite enjoyable, and Alan Bechtold noting that he was hooked on it and that it proved that a solid and fast-moving game is more important than flashy graphics and arcade tunes. Electronic Fun with Computers and Games gave it 3 joysticks, with reviewer Ed Hulse writing that fans of Donkey Kong should find it stimulating, though adding that it didn't take him long to master. The video game update called it the first Apollo game since Space Cavern that they really liked, complimenting its visual and sound design. Electronic Games highlighted its usage of elevators as rather novel and considered it the best game in Apollo's entire line. They later gave it a Certificate of Merit in the Archie Award for Best Solitary Game, writing positively about how it combines elements of a platformer and a maze shoot game to make something unique. In Arcade Express, Joyce Worley complimented its use of color and its mix of shooting in the climbing genre to keep things lively. And Video Games described it as a mashup of Berserk and Donkey Kong, but did not delve into whether or not it's worth grabbing. On the flip side, Michael Blanchett found it monotonous and overly difficult, losing interest after looping back to the top of the screen a second time due to the enemy's speed increases. Infiltrate may not make up for Apollo's dicey track record thus far, but it certainly shows that the company was capable of putting out some genuinely interesting and unique games that also play very well when given a chance. At this point in time, Apollo really only had a couple more months of activity as a commercial entity before it crashed and burned, but its last set of VCS games, led by Infiltrate, are generally pretty good. Perhaps this cartridge wasn't going to save the company, but at least Hoffman's efforts were the vanguard of some of Apollo's best work. Our second and objectively more successful game, Megamania, was developed by Steve Cartwright, last seen with Barnstorming in March. Here, you control a spaceship at the bottom of the screen and are tasked with eliminating waves of weird enemy objects before you run out of fuel. Each group has its own movement patterns, and as you progress, they get ever faster and more difficult to clear. If this sounds somewhat familiar, that would be because Megamania is based off of Sega's 1981 hit Astro Blaster, just as Sierra's Threshold was. You can review that video for more details on Astro Blaster, but in short, it was based on Data East's 1979 slide-and-shoot game Astro Fighter, only expanded in concept to a title with novel enemy patterns, sprites, and actions every wave, hidden score bonuses, a temperature gauge for your gun, a warp button that slows down the action, and refueling segments. Megamania does away with the warp button, refueling sequences, and temperature gauge, as well as the hidden score bonuses, but otherwise serves as a pretty solid ripoff of Sega's coin-op game. Cartwright has provided a few comments on the game in interviews over the years. In an interview posted on Atari Age's forums in 2017, he remarked that Activision's developers pulled an inspiration from a variety of sources, including the arcade space. He mentioned visiting the local Chuck E. Cheese 3 times a week. In an older interview in the Atari 2600 Connection zine from 1991, he mentions the Astro Blaster Connection explicitly, remarking that it was the simplest game in the arcade and the only one he could play well. The space theming was there from the jump, but the colorful conceit in the marketing materials that you are battling hamburgers, bow ties, dice, and other otherwise normal objects apparently wasn't intended at first. In his 2017 interview, Cartwright mentions that he'd tried to draw unique alien ships and that there was only so much he could do with the limitations of the hardware. That said, he and his fellow designers felt that even though the game was far ahead of what their competitors were selling, a generic space theme would cause it to be lost in the crowd. Marketing identified his sprites as something much weirder, and that led to the company trying to market it much differently than other similar space shooters. Cartwright and his fellows liked this idea, but settling on a name took a couple tries. The marketing staff initially proposed the title Gadzooks, but the developer felt that didn't quite work. The second suggestion, Megamania, a space nightmare, went over much better and stuck. Jim Levy described how this concept came about in more detail in the Australian periodical Score. There, he explained that when they sat down to draft the box text, they felt they needed to explain how it came to be that the player would be in space fending off weird objects. Their conclusion is that the player is a space cadet who, after having some root beer and pizza after a hard patrol, is having a nightmare about fighting these things. This bizarre storyline gives the game some great flavor, and does a great job setting it apart the way the marketing team had proposed. With its oddball setting, this could credibly be considered an early parody game in the vein of later titles like Parodius or Ock Invader. The Astro Blaster influence is pretty clear once you sit down with Megamania. You are tasked with shooting your way through 8 unique types of enemies before starting a second loop, and you have a limited amount of time to do so before your ship runs out of fuel, which takes about 45 seconds. Each wave of enemies have their own movement pattern, and these will even change depending on the loop you're on. Like an Astro Blaster, your foes will be trying to shoot back at you, or ram you during their movement cycles. There aren't many game options here. The select switch determines whether or not your missiles will follow your horizontal position, and if the game is set up for 1 or 2 players, while the difficulty switches adjust missile speed. Fortunately, the core game itself is appealing. While there isn't much variety here in terms of enemies as Astro Blaster, your weird foes all stand out very nicely on the VCS, and the mixture of attack patterns keep things interesting. You get a bonus life every 10,000 points, which is just often enough to keep the game incredibly challenging without being punishing or too easy in my experience. And once again, Megamania follows the Activision tradition of having a high score patch available for solid players. By sending in a photo with 45,000 points or more, you could become an official Megamaniac. Cartwright offered some advice in the game manual, indicating that one trick if you have enough lives stockpiled is to destroy most of the enemy ships and then intentionally take a death to refill your fuel gauge. This allows you to maximize your bonus points, though it really depends on how skilled you are at stockpiling those lives. Perhaps the most direct game to compare Megamania to at this point on the VCS is Tiger Vision's Threshold, which debuted 2 months earlier and was also based on Astro Blaster. Threshold's original Apple II rendition retained more of its inspiration, with the VCS conversion losing the temperature gauge, a lot of the enemy types, and reimagined the fuel gauge as a bonus score meter. Yet looking at the two, Megamania is a much more refined package, with more interesting sprite work and a faster pace. Threshold has a few more game options and is certainly enjoyable. But the audio and visual elements Activision was known for really shine in a side-by-side. And evidently, Activision's ad campaign for Megamania paid off well enough. According to Cashbox's retailer survey, Megamania was the 7th best-selling video game in the US by early 1983, with other Activision games Pitfall and River Raid taking the first 2 slots. This also led to Megamania getting ported to the Atari 5200 and 8-bit computer platforms in 1984. First announced by Activision in the November 1983 press release, where it was referred to as one of the company's most popular titles. Activision's president Jim Levy referred to it as one of the company's classics when discussing this in a June 1984 interview in the magazine Antic, alongside the aforementioned River Raid and Pitfall, 2 games that he indicated sold more than 1 million copies. So even if Megamania didn't crack that threshold, it still likely came close. These 8-bit ports, adapted by Glenn Anderson, juice up the enemy sprites to better clarify them as their manual descriptions, but otherwise they play pretty much identically to the VCS original, which speaks to how well put together Megamania is. Cartwright has mentioned that he felt his later work Frostbite may have been the better game, but Megamania hit right at the peak of the VCS market, allowing it the room to sell better than his other titles. It also saw a number of very positive reviews. The video game update gave it 4 stars to graphics and 3.5 for gameplay, describing it as a dazzling and relentless action game. Electronic Games gushed about its premise, graphics, and variety, calling it Activision at its whimsical best. The magazine later gave it an Archie Award for Most Humorous Video Game. Joystick gave it strong scores in longevity and play, considering it one of the most original titles developed for the home yet, and one that Space Invaders players would enjoy. Video Gaming Illustrated also gave it an award for Best 2600 Game in 1983, citing the visual design, the sound effects, and the scoring. Personal Computing Today covered Megamania in a roundup of gaming software in 1983, calling it compulsive, a must-buy, and the best of the games they reviewed. Even the frequently irreverent Vidiot gave it a pretty positive write-up, praising its humor and difficulty. Though not everyone had glowing praise. Writing for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Lou Hudson called it a very good Space Invaders type game in terms of variety, color, detail, and difficulty, but that he struggled to get excited for the genre anymore outside of Space Cavern and Demon Attack. And Logical Gamer's reviewers were both lukewarm to Cartwright's work, with Mike Wilson writing that this is one of the few Activision games that had room for improvement, and Alan Bechtold finding it to be little more than yet another slide-and-shoot game, albeit with some humor. Writing about the 5200 and 8-bit versions, Michael Blanchett described it as just another shooting game as well, just with weird visuals and a lot of hype. Needless to say, what you get out of Megamania really depends on your tastes. If you enjoy these early shooters pulling from titles like Space Invaders or Galaga, then Megamania holds up remarkably well, and its contemporary praise continues to ring true. This remains a game with a good amount of variety in enemies and patterns to keep you busy. But if the concept isn't enough to hook you on a type of game that is starting to saturate the VCS as much as it had the coin-op space, then you'll probably want to skip it. Activision generally, and Cartwright in particular, have some especially great shooters coming up in future months. So even if Megamania isn't enough to hook you, odds are you'll find something good soon enough. Next time, riddle me this.